Welcome to another Bio 151 lecture. A few announcements before we get started. Sapling Chapter 44 and 45 are due on Sunday by 11:59 p.m. Office hours are via Zoom, Tuesdays and Thursdays from 1 to 3 p.m. Today we're going to be talking about population ecology. So that's studying the ecology of populations of organisms. One of the coolest populations in the world, in my opinion, are these organisms which we're looking at from an aerial view. These are all wildebeest. And the Great Wildebeest Migration is the annual migration of giant herds of grazers across northern Tanzania and Kenya, and it's a truly spectacular event. It can be seen from outer space. Over 2 million wildebeest, zebras, and gazelles move through the Serengeti and Masai Mara ecosystems in search of green pastures in a regular annual pattern. And it's just an amazing spectacle to see. Another really cool population of organisms are krill. So in this picture, we have a whale shark, and it's going to eat a population of krill. And krill average about 2 inches in length, but they represent a giant-sized link in the global food chain. These small shrimp-like crustaceans are essentially the fuel that run the engine of the Earth's marine ecosystem. Arctic krill are among the largest of the 85 known krill species, and their estimated numbers, their population, ranges from 125 million tons to 6 billion tons in the waters around Antarctica. And during certain times of the year, krill congregate in swarms so dense and widespread that they can be seen from space. So something about the size of a paperclip congregates in such large densities that you can see them from outer space. Ecology is the study of the relationships of organisms to one another and to the environment. Ecological relationships sustain a flow of energy and materials from the sun, earth, and atmosphere through organisms, with carbon and other elements eventually returning to the environment. So an ecosystem is the combination of all the living or biotic organisms along with all of the abiotic physical features of the environment. A population is all of the individuals of a given species that live and reproduce in a particular place. So if you think about it, we have in this example an individual clownfish. And you're probably familiar with clownfish from Finding Nemo. A population of clownfish are all of the clownfish living together in one location. A community is all of the organisms living together in that area, and then the ecosystem is all of the living organisms combined with all of the abiotic parameters. A population, which is what we're focusing on today, is defined by 3 key features: size, range, and density. So the population size is the number of individuals of all ages alive at a particular time in a particular place. So in that one picture I showed you, you saw that large swarm of krill. So for example, the population of krill around Antarctica is estimated to be around 80 trillion individuals. So you can see here is our population size, and here is one individual within the population. The geographic range is how widely a population is spread and the factors that determine its distribution. So for example, the krill population ranges through an area of 19 million square kilometers around Antarctica. So if we look at this map up top, you can see that this darker brown color is the range of the krill. The range of any species reflects the range of climates a population can tolerate and determines how many other species the population encounters. So for example, for the Arctic krill, they cannot tolerate warm water temperatures, so they're restricted to those cooler waters around Antarctica. Population density is defined as a population size divided by its range. In effect, population density tells us how crowded or dispersed the individuals are that make up the population. For krill, 800 trillion animals are spread over 19 million square kilometers, which is a density of approximately 42 million animals per square kilometers. But the density does not necessarily have to be distributed evenly. So if we look at this figure down here, they took the range of the krill and divided it by the number of this krill in each area. And you can see in certain areas where there's darker squares, you have higher numbers of krill than in areas where you have lighter squares. So the population density does not have to be even across the range of a population. So there's 3 different types of population distribution, which is affected by the population density across its range. Characterizing population density as average density across this range is often useful, but it can be misleading depending on how the organisms are distributed. In random distribution, which we see in this first figure here, a new individual has an equal chance of occupying any position within the range, and the location of one individual has no influence on where the next will occur. In a clumped distribution, which is the second figure here, individuals cluster together in a small space. This occurs sometimes when resources are distributed patchily within the range. It may also occur if the chances of a new individual surviving are enhanced by the presence of another individual. So for example, for the wildebeest, when they're migrating and even when they're just grazing on the savanna, it's beneficial for them to stay in herds in a clumped distribution, because then it's harder for each individual wildebeest in that population to be picked off by lion predators. The last type of distribution, which is in this final figure, is uniform distribution. And this is when individuals are distributed more nearly evenly than would be predicted by random chance. This occurs if all individuals depend on the same set of resources. So by being uniformly distributed across the habitat, each individual is able to access the same amount of resources. It may also occur if predators, having located one prey individual, they might search for other members of the same species nearby, so then they might spread out in a uniform distribution. Ecologists estimate population size by taking repeated samples of a population and then estimating the total number of individuals based on these samples, because it's very difficult to actually count every single individual of a particular species in an ecosystem. There's 3 different ways that ecologists tend to try to estimate population size. The first is by using transects, and a transect is a line across a habitat or a part of a habitat. And then what you do is you count the number of organisms of each species along a transect. So for example, in this picture down here, this person is walking across a transect dragging a cloth, and you do this when you're sampling for ticks. So it's called dragging for ticks. So you walk along your transect line for a set distance. You then stop and remove all of the ticks from your cloth, and then you can count them and identify which species there are. And you'll do this multiple times in the same area, and that will allow you to estimate your population size. Another way that you can do this is by using quadrats, which is basically setting up some sort of frame around a set size area. And this is traditionally a square. So you could see this in the second picture. There's a quadrat set up, and these ecologists can go and then they can count the number of organisms within the designated space. And this is very commonly used for things such as plants, since they're not moving. So you could see which plants are growing in different transects quadrats, across your habitat. Mark and recapture is the capture of individuals, marking them in a way that does not affect their function or behavior, and releasing them back into the wild. So you could see here on this monarch butterfly, it has been captured and it has a mark that identifies which number individual it was that was captured. You then capture a second set of individuals, hoping to get some of your individuals that were previously marked. And there's a mathematical equation that you can use, which you don't need to know, but is in your book if you'd like to look it up, where you can actually calculate the population size based on the number of marked individuals, comparing it to the number of recaptured marked individuals. So that way you can get an estimate of your population size. So what factors actually affect population size? Trends in population size are a key focus of ecological research and its application to conservation biology when you're thinking about threatened or endangered species. We also use it in disease ecology. So I look at factors that affect the population size of mosquitoes to determine how we can reduce their populations, or in most conservation biology studies, they're trying to increase the populations. A decrease in size through time, for example, might signal declining health of a local population, which is very important if we're thinking about commercially harvested fish, for example, or an endangered species. There's many factors that affect population size, but we're only going to focus on these main four for right now. Births increase population size, and immigration increases population size. Population sizes decrease due to death or mortality, and they also decrease due to emigration. So we like to look at how birth and death rate and immigration and emigration rates affect our size of our population in a particular area. So we can use a mathematical model to look at this. So we have multiple variables that we're going to use. Anytime you see this triangle, which is delta, it means change in. So if you have a delta t, you would have a change in time. N in our equations today is going to stand for population size. N1 is population size at time 1, or the first time you're taking a measurement. N2 is the population size at time 2, or the second time you're taking a measurement. B stands for births, D stands for deaths, I stands for immigration, and E stands for emigration. This would be a great thing to put on your note sheet for when you're taking your next exam. So if we want to see how our population is changing, we can look at this equation. Our delta N, or our change in population size, is equal to N2 minus N1. And all this means is that our change in population is our second time point, how many individuals were there, subtracted from our first time point. So what's the change in the number of individuals? If this number is positive, our population is growing, so we're adding individuals. If this number is 0, the population size is staying constant. And if this number is negative, we're having a decrease in our population size. But a lot of times we don't really want to know just the difference between the population size. We want to know what are the factors that are actually driving these changes. And so we can have a slightly more complex equation. So we can have our delta n, our change in population size, is equal to births minus deaths plus immigration minus emigration. And so by making this a slightly more complex equation, we can see if maybe there's something happening with the number of deaths that is causing our population to decline, as opposed to it being emigration where individuals are leaving the population. So looking at these parameters can be very helpful when trying to figure out what changes are happening within your population. Per capita growth rate can also be calculated. So here we have the same variables, but we have some new variables. So here we have our delta, change in, n is still population size, t stands for time, and r stands for our per capita growth rate. And per capita growth rate is the rate of population growth per individual. Now, every individual in the population will not reproduce at the same amount. It's just what is the average per individual. For example, in the United States, the per capita growth rate for an individual is 2.3 children. It's not possible for somebody to have 1/3 of a child. So it's just the average. And we have an equation for this. The per capita growth rate is equal to our change in population size divided by the change in time, and all of that is divided by our population size at time point 1. Now we can rearrange this equation to get delta n divided by delta t is equal to Rn. And this equation here allows us to calculate the change in population over time for a population with a known individual growth rate or per capita growth rate for a population of a known size of a population. And we use this for populations that are discrete populations, which means they have synchronized reproduction. So for example, a lot of plants have discrete populations where at a certain period of time every year, they will all reproduce, and then there's no more reproduction happening for the rest of the year. So we're going to go over an example problem so we can practice using some of these new equations. Now, every time that I have an example math problem, I'm going to put these boxes up. And this strategy is known as guess, with the idea is that you never guess on a math word problem ever again. If you feel comfortable doing word problems without using this strategy, that is totally fine and you don't need to use this, but I'm putting this here as a resource in case you feel like you're not very strong in your math skills. And I'm going to go through how you use guess. So here's our example problem. A population starts with 80 individuals. After 2 years, it has grown to 120 individuals. What is the per capita growth rate of the population? So the first thing you do in guess is you pick out all of the givens. So anytime you see a number in the word problem, you write it down in the given box. You also put what it stands for. So for example, we have 80 individuals, and this is our starting population or our first time point. So this is equal to N1. We also have 2 years, so that stands for time. And we have 120 individuals, and that's after 2 years, so that's our second time point, so that is our N2. So once you've written down all of the numbers in your problem, then you need to figure out what the question is actually asking you. And this question is, what is the per capita growth rate for this population? So if we're thinking about our equations, what variable stands for per capita growth rate? It's R. So we're trying to solve for R. So this is when we look at our givens and our unknowns and try to figure out which equation we need to use. So we learned that the change in population is N2 minus N1, and we need that delta N in order to complete the equation to solve for R. So in this example, we're going to be using two different equations. And in the equation box, you just always write down all of the equations that you need for this problem. The next thing you're going to do is substitute. When you substitute, you first rearrange your equations using the variables. Do not plug in your numbers until you are done rearranging your equations. You are much less likely to cause an error in your math if you do it this way. So we know that delta N is equal to N2 minus N1. We have delta N here in this equation to solve for R. So all that we need to do is plug in this equation for delta N. And now we have rearranged our equation and we can plug in our numbers. So here we plug in our numbers. We have N2 minus N1 divided by delta T, which is the change in time, which was 2 years, divided by N1. And then you do your math, and in your last S box, that's your solution, and our R is 0.25. So the per capita growth rate for this population is 0.25. So now we're going to do another example problem. A population starts with 80 individuals and has an intrinsic growth rate, R, of 0.25. What will the population size be in 2 years? So again, we're going to use the guess strategy. So first, for our G, we need to write down all of the givens, all of the numbers that are in this problem. So we have 80 individuals, and that's N1 because that's our start of our population. We then have 2 years, which is time, and we have our R, which is 0.25. And now we need to do the U in guess, or unknown. So what is the question asking us? It's asking us, what will the population size be in 2 years? So what is N2? So now we need to look at our givens and our unknowns to figure out which equations we should use. So we have R, N1, and T. So we know we need to use our R equation. We can rearrange this equation so that now we have R times N1 is equal to delta N divided by T. We can continue to rearrange this equation, so we have delta N is equal to R times N1 times delta T. Now, we have another equation that we can use that has delta N and N2 in it, which is delta N is equal to N2 minus N1. But we don't want to solve for delta N, we want to solve for N2. So let's rearrange this equation. N2 is equal to delta N plus N1. Now that we have these equations, we can plug in our numbers. So here's our first equation that we have to use. So if we plug in our numbers, we have delta N is equal to 0.25 times 80 times 2, which is equal to 40. Now we can use our second equation that we rearranged to figure out what N2 is equal to. So if we plug in our numbers, we get N2 is equal to our delta N, which is equal to 40, plus N1, which is equal to 80. So our solution is that N2 is equal to 120 individuals. Now, if you've been paying attention from the last question, all that we did here was go in different directions. In the last example problem, we were given our N1 and N2 and had to figure out R. And in this problem, I gave you N1 and R, and you had to figure out N2. So hopefully having these examples going in different directions will help you when you're studying. So now you have your first question for today. A population of 500 has an intrinsic growth rate R of 0.2. What will the population size be after 1 year? Is it A, 500, B, 533, C, 600, or D, 750? So pause the video and complete this question below. So populations can grow in different ways. Continuous growth of a population occurs when the organisms are not producing all at the same time, which means that they're not synchronized. An example of organisms that reproduce all the time are humans. There's always babies being born. Exponential growth is a specific type of continuous growth. In exponential growth, there's a pattern of population increase that results when R is constant through time. In exponential growth, the number of individuals added to the population in any time interval is proportional to the size of the population at the start of the interval. And this usually occurs in small populations with abundant resources. So if we're looking at this figure here, you can see that our per capita growth rate is constant, but our actual number of individuals added at a given interval of time increases because even though R is constant, the starting population that we're looking at each interval is always getting larger. And so we have an equation that we can use. Our variables are n sub t, which is the population size at any time t, n sub 0, which is our population size at time 0, E stands for Euler's number, which is 2.718, T stands for time, and R is the per capita growth rate. And so the equation we can use when we have exponential growth is n sub t, where the population at any given time t is equal to the population size at time 0 multiplied by Euler's number to the time times per capita growth rate. So we can use this equation to figure out how populations will grow exponentially. Darwin recognized that when the number of young produced at birth exceeds the number of adults that can be supported by available resources, individuals within the population will compete to obtain the resources needed for growth and reproduction. The maximum number of individuals any habitat can support is called the carrying capacity, which is represented by the letter K. In a sense, carrying capacity, or K, represents the interplay among individuals' requirement for growth and reproduction and the environmental resources such as food and space available to support these needs. When a population is small, resources are not limiting, and the population can grow at or near its intrinsic growth rate R, which means it's having exponential growth. But as the population increases, drawing closer to the carrying capacity K, the worsening conditions due to crowding and lack of food slow the growth rate. And so what we see when we have populations that have a particular carrying capacity within their environment, instead of seeing exponential growth, we see logistic growth. And the logistic growth is the pattern of population growth that results as growth potential slows down as the population size approaches K, which is its maximum sustainable size. And you can see here, all the way until we get up to halfway to the carrying capacity, this graph looks identical to the exponential growth graph. But Once resources start to become scarce and competition grows, we see that the population growth rate starts to slow until we reach that carrying capacity. We can calculate what our population growth rate is at any time in logistic growth by using this equation below. So we've seen most of these variables before. The only new one that we have is K, which is our carrying capacity. So our population size at any time t is equal to our population size at time 1 plus our per capita growth rate times our population size at time 1 times carrying capacity minus our population size divided by carrying capacity. So we're going to watch a short video to help us understand logistic growth a little bit better.
The growth of almost all natural populations follows a similar pattern, though none can increase indefinitely. The maximum number of individuals that a habitat can support is its carrying capacity, or K. Here we examine the growth of a population of algae in a pond. Growth of the population begins rapidly as each individual reproduces at the maximum rate for the species. The maximum rate of growth per individual, when growth is not limited by resources or other factors, is called the intrinsic growth rate and is indicated by the letter R. For any given population, R is constant and the result is an exponential increase in population size through time. In time, crowding, lack of resources, and other factors will decrease the rate of growth below R. When this occurs, population growth rate slows down. Eventually, the rate of growth levels off because of the scarcity of available resources. At this point, the population approaches the maximum number of individuals the environment can support. This S-shaped pattern of population growth is called logistic growth. The first part of the curve reflects the rate at which individuals can reproduce, and the second reflects the onset of factors such as available food and space that come into play above a certain population size.
Okay, so hopefully that video was helpful in helping you understand logistic growth. So now we have another example problem. And again, we are going to use guess so that you never have to guess on a math problem again. So here's our problem this time. A population of 100 individuals has a carrying capacity K of 300 and an intrinsic growth rate R of 0.15. What will be the population size after 1 year? So just a reminder, when we use guess, our first thing we do is G. We find all of our givens in our word problem. So we have N sub 1, which is 100 individuals. We have carrying capacity K of 300 individuals. We have R equal to 0.15. And we have time is equal to 1 year. And our question is asking, what will the population size be after that 1 year? So the question is asking, what is N sub T equal to? So thinking about our variables in our given and our unknown, we have an equation that we can use. It's the equation that we learned for logistic growth. N sub t is equal to n1 plus r times n1 times k minus n1 divided by k. We do not need to rearrange this equation this time because it's already equal to n sub t. So all that we need to do is plug in our numbers. Calculate that, and our population size after 1 year will be 110 individuals. So you can see how adding in a carrying capacity can really limit the number of individuals that are added to the population due to competition for resources. So now you have a practice problem to do. A population of 500 has a carrying capacity K of 750 and an intrinsic growth rate R of 0.2. What will the population size be after 1 year? A, 500, B, 533, C, 600, or D, 750. So pause the video and answer the second question below. All right, I hope you're becoming really great at all of these population ecology equations. If you feel like you're struggling, make sure you attend office hours or set up an individual appointment with me. One more question. As a population approaches its carrying capacity, its growth rate A, increases, B, stays the same, C, decreases, or D, stops. Pause the video and answer the question below. All right, so now we're going to talk about factors that affect carrying capacity. We have density independent and density dependent factors that affect carrying capacity. At low densities, food and other resources do not limit growth. As density increases, they exert more and more influence on population growth, spurring competition for available resources. Similarly, at high population density, individuals may be more vulnerable to predation or to infection. So different factors that are density dependent and affect the carrying capacity of a population. So that is competition for resources, increased chance of disease transmission because of the close contact of the population, more predator attacks, and increased waste production, which could then cause your resources to not be as readily available or for disease to be transmitted through your population. Density independent factors influence population size without regard to the population's density. These factors include events such as severe drought or a prolonged cold period, storms, volcanic eruptions, fires, things like that. These factors can cause widespread mortality independent of how many individuals are in the population. Human effects such as habitat destruction can also affect the carrying capacity of an area. So here's an example of a density independent factor that affects the carrying capacity of a population. So here we're looking at the population growth in Scottish red deer as a function to cold and rainy weather. And on our x-axis, we have our average April to May daily temperature and year of birth. So you can see we're starting from a colder temperature and going to a warmer temperature. On our y-axis, we have percent of females born in a given year surviving to adulthood, from 90% to up to 100%. And you can see that the years when it's colder, you have less females surviving to adulthood compared to when it is warmer. So the weather's affecting the survival of the females regardless of how many individuals are being born on a given year, because we're looking in this figure at percentage surviving. So that's an example of how a density independent event can affect carrying capacity of a population. Demography is the study of the size, structure, and distribution of populations over time. It includes changes in response to birth, aging, migration, and death. Age structure diagrams show the numbers of males and females of different age classes or cohorts in a population. And for each cohort, we look at fecundity, which is the number of offspring produced, mortality, or the number of deaths, and survivorship, which is the number of individuals surviving from one age group to the next. So here we have three different age structure diagrams. In this first age structure diagram, we're going to go over how you read it. On the x-axis, you have your population size. So the wider these bars, the greater the number of individuals in each age group or cohort. On your y-axis, you have your age in years. And so this is looking at different populations of humans in different cities. So you can see here in this first one, the number of males and the number of females is relatively even across the entire lifespan of these individuals. When you have a population that's weighted towards very young age classes, the population will grow quickly. And that's because these younger age classes have not yet reached reproductive age. And when they do, they will be able to reproduce in larger numbers because there's more of them. In a stable population that's balanced across most of the age classes except for very old ages, this balanced population will remain relatively stable because you're basically replacing each deceased individual with another individual. And then when you see basically an inverted triangle, your population is decreasing or it's weighted towards old age classes. And that's a population that will decline because you have less individuals that will enter reproductive age in the population. So when we're looking at our age structure diagrams, this reproductive age group is really important in telling us how our population is going to change over time. Will it increase? Will it be stable? Or will it decrease? Different organisms exhibit different survivorship curves, which means different abilities or different ways that they reproduce and survive to adulthood. And there's 3 different survivorship curves. The first is type 1. And in type 1 animals and plants, most mortality is late in life. So when we're thinking about type 1, we have 100 individuals or 100%, and most of them survive to adulthood and then many die. Organisms that have type 1 survivorship curves are organisms such as elephants, whales, mountain goats, sea lions, and other larger mammals. Type 2 survivorship curves has constant mortality throughout the life of the organism. And so these are birds, and many small mammals and reptiles have this. So you have the same chance of dying from when you're born until very old age. And then type 3 survivorship curve animals and plants have a very high mortality at the earliest stages of their life cycle, but once they pass that, the ones that reach maturity live for a long time. And so examples of these organisms are small herbaceous plants, small animals such as mice and insects, many fish, and sea turtles, because sea turtles lay hundreds of eggs and do not take care of them. So most of them will not make it to adulthood, but the ones that do make it to adulthood survive for a long time. And we can think about these survivorship curves the same way we think about reproductive strategies. So life history is the typical pattern of resource investment in each stage of a given species' lifetime. How an organism uses these resources available can also affect population growth, because each individual must devote some of its available food and energy intake to growth, some to maintenance of cells and tissues, and some to reproduction. So making sure that all these organisms in the population are using resources effectively will affect the population growth. So we talked about R and K strategists when we talked about reproduction, but now we're going to tie it into population growth rates. R strategists are species that produce large numbers of offspring but provide few resources for their offspring's support. In general, species that live in unpredictable environments produce many young. There are strategists. So for example, fish, and amphibians would be considered R strategists, and many insects. For example, when the environment is full of predators watching for vulnerable prey, or when resources are patchily distributed and abundant only for a short time, the chances of a young organism surviving to adulthood are low. And so it makes sense to produce many offspring, but not put in a lot of investment because most of them will not survive to adulthood. And you can see that if you're an R strategist, you are living a type 3 survivorship curve. So most of your offspring will die, but the few that make it to adulthood end up living and reproducing. K strategists produce relatively few young, but invest considerable resources into the support of their young. Species living where resources are predictable often produce a smaller number of offspring and invest their reproductive resources in just a few, often larger and better cared for offspring. These offspring are better protected from predators, able to compete with others when they are young, and more likely to survive periods of bad weather. So if we go back to our survivorship curves, organisms, especially larger organisms that are type 1 organisms, put in a lot of resources into their offspring. So most of their offspring, because they have few of them, but care for them, survive for a long period of time. And it's not until they reach adulthood when many of them die. And if we think about our population growth curves that we talked about today, our strategists are basically on this part of our population size growth curve. They're an R, the intrinsic growth rate. So they are going to reproduce a lot. K strategists are organisms that are thinking more about the carrying capacity of the environment, so they do not produce as many offspring, but they care for them to ensure their survival. So here's a chart to help you think about the differences between R-selected and K-selected populations. So R-selected populations reproduce early, have short lifespans, take a short time to mature. Their mortality rate is often very high, especially when they're young. They have many offspring per reproductive episode, but they have few reproductive episodes per lifetime, and they have no parental care, and the size of their offspring or eggs are small. Whereas you can see that K-selected populations are the opposite. So an example of an R-selected population are mosquitoes, and you can see this female mosquito, which is this particular species, is one of the species that transmits West Nile virus. You can see her laying her eggs in an egg raft, and she can lay up to 300 eggs at one time, but she will not care for her young at all, and most of her young will not make it to adulthood. Semiluparity are organisms that focus reproductive efforts on a single large event. So for example, this mosquito. Iteroparity are organisms that produce offspring several times over many seasons. So a good example are most mammals. So if you think of humans, we can produce offspring almost every year, a little bit more than once a year, or a little bit less than once per year. So these different strategies have to do with R or K selected populations. A metapopulation is a large population made up of smaller populations linked by occasional movement of individuals between them. So in this example, we can see that we have different patches, population A, B, and C, which are our patches of undisturbed or less disturbed habitat. And these populations are separated by this disturbed human habitat. So groves of trees can support population of nuthatches, even though not many are currently occupied. Individual nuthatches can move between populations in different groves indicated by corridors. So in this example, the nuthatches can follow the streets and move between the different patches. The independent populations connected by migrants constitute a metapopulation of nuthatches. So a metapopulation is just multiple populations that are connected by corridors of some kind. Small populations become extinct more often than large populations, and this is because small populations are more susceptible to random factors that increase mortality. So if your population living in a small patch, you're more likely to go extinct. So if we look here, they did an experiment where they had patches of moss on a rock. And here is the size of the control patch. And on the control patch of moss, there is an average of 17 arthropod species. They then made smaller isolated patches. So they took a large patch and cut it into 3 smaller sections. And a year later, on these smaller patches, there was an average of 7 arthropod species. An average of 7 arthropod species had become extinct. So we went from having 17 species to only having 10 species on each of these patches. But when they connected the patches with corridors, fewer arthropod species became extinct. So only 2 species became extinct instead of 7. So the size and the connectedness of these patches of habitats affects the probability that species inhabiting the habitat would become extinct. And this is something that's been studied heavily in disease transmission. So here's a picture of a suburb in upstate New York where Lyme disease is very prevalent. And when you have these small forest patches in suburbs, you have a greater chance of Lyme disease cases in the area because of this habitat fragmentation. And if that seems something that's interesting to you, you should take my class next spring, Disease Ecology and Human Health, because we'll study how habitat fragmentation and patches and connectedness of habitats can affect disease transmission to humans. So now we have another question. Giant clams synchronize their reproduction with the phases of the moon. During these reproductive bouts, a single clam can release approximately 500 million eggs to be fertilized in the water column by sperm released from other clams. However, the population size of giant clams are very low because many of the fertilized eggs and larvae will be eaten by fish in the local area. What type of survivorship curve would you expect to see in giant clams? Pause the video and answer the question below. Okay, and one more question for today. Same scenario with our giant clams, but this time the question is asking, based on this information, what can be said of the reproductive strategy of the giant clam? Is it an A, R strategist, or B, a K strategist? So pause the video and answer the last question below. And that's it for our population ecology lecture. If you have any questions, please post them on the discussion board, email me, or attend Zoom office hours on Tuesdays and Thursdays from 1 to 3. And don't forget to submit your clicker questions below. And here's some pictures of an emperor penguin colony. I hope you have a great day.